Hello, my name is Keith Schumacher, and my project is called Identifying Isolated Subgraphs, Classifying Spring Mass Networks. In this presentation, I'll cover what spring mass networks are used for, describe the dataset, and discuss two classification techniques and their effectiveness. Spring mass networks are basically a series of masses connected to each other with springs. You can imagine that the entire network would flex and vibrate when a mass is excited away from its equilibrium position. They are used for things like cloth simulation and computer graphics, protein dynamics and biology, describing the phonon structure of molecules in chemistry, and studying the correlation of assets and markets in quantitative finance. In this project, I attempt to identify what networks a mass belongs to based on its vibrations. 3 topologies were studied for this project: 3 masses with 2 springs, 5 masses with 8 springs, and 9 masses with 20 springs. None of the nodes or masses were fixed in place. On this slide, we have the relevant equations that describe the dynamics of the system. E is the elongation of each spring. A is the node edge incidence matrix, basically describing the connectivity of the graphs. Y is the restoring force from each spring. K is a matrix describing the stiffness of each spring. S is the stiffness matrix. X is the distance from equilibrium for each mass, and F is the force felt by each mass. The primary physical concept for this data is Hooke's law, which says that the force required to extend or compress a spring is linearly proportional to the distance the spring is extended or compressed. 2 cases were tested. All the springs in a given network have the same spring constant, and all the springs have random spring constants. The spring constant is basically how stiff a spring is. On this slide, we describe the methods used for simulation. I used Euler's method for simulation. The force acceleration is calculated for the current configuration. Then the acceleration flows into a change of velocity and then a change of position at each time step. After simulating the dynamics, the data is downsampled. Only 1 sample per 100 is used for classification. The time series were initially 50,000 entries, and so they end up being 500 entries for the classification purposes. Here we have a video showing the network dynamics. The first half of the video shows the network to which each vertex belongs. The networks /vertices/edges are color-coded, either red or blue. Next, the vibrating vertices without edges and color coding are shown. Near the end of the video, the vibrating vertices without visualization offsets are shown. Here, each vertex moves around its equilibrium, which for this video is centered at the origin. It is this final representation of the data that I attempt to classify as belonging to a particular network. In this first video, the initial positions are all symmetric, which is why the motion of the network vibration seems symmetric. In the second video, all of the spring constants are random, and as well as the initial conditions, which is why the vibrations look more chaotic. Time series classification algorithms can be broken into several broad categories. Whole series versus intervals. The differences are whether or not the features are derived from the entire series, or if the series is broken into intervals and features are extracted from each interval. Then we have shapelets versus dictionary-based. Shapelet-based algorithms attempt to find patterns in the data that differentiates classes. Dictionary-based methods effectively look for sequences of shapelets. Spectral methods draw features from frequency space as opposed to the temporal domain, and combined methods combine algorithms from each of these categories and aggregate their results. For this project, I compared 2 classification algorithms: time series forest, also known as TSF, and random interval spectral ensemble, also known as RISE. Another consideration is that our network dynamics occur in 2D space, meaning that each vertex's trajectory is a multivariate time series. Most time series classification implementations only support univariate data. I use the skTime library for Python. It provides two methods for working with multivariate data: column concatenation, in which the time series for each dimension are tagged onto each other. So for this project, my time series ended up being of length 500, consisting of 2D data. The column concatenation method transforms these into a time series of 1,000 entries each. Then the classification estimator is run on this larger time series. The other method for handling multivariate data is column ensembling, which applies an estimator to each dimension of a time series, then aggregates the results. For this project, I compare both these methods of handling multivariate data. Time series forest is a random forest method. The time series is broken into random intervals, and the decision tree is created for each interval. The splitting criterion are based on features derived from the interval, such as mean, standard deviation, and slope. Here the slope is referring to the slope of the least squares regression line applied to the time series data within the interval. Then the time series forest prediction. So the overall prediction of this algorithm is the mode of the decision tree's prediction. Basically, each decision tree gets a vote, and the majority vote wins in terms of predicting the class of a sample. Random interval spectral ensemble method is basically the frequency domain analog to the time series forest method. Random intervals are drawn the same way, but the features are taken from the frequency domain. It should be noted that the intervals are taken over the temporal domain, not the frequency domain. But the features are then taken from a frequency domain representation of each interval. Features that are considered are things like the autocorrelation and squared Fourier terms. On this slide, we have some results. As expected, the classification accuracy decreases when spring stiffness is random in each network, as opposed to each spring being equally stiff in each network. This would make sense because the differential equations that describe, or that the data was generated from, the solutions to these describe oscillations, and the frequency of these oscillations are typically functions of the spring constants. And so when all the spring constants in a network are the same, you'd expect there to be some kind of similarity in the frequencies of all the masses attached. Whereas when all the spring constants are random, there's a lot more chaotic motion. Time series forests perform better when there were more training samples. The more training samples here means that 50% of all samples were used for training and the other 50 for test. And RISE performed better when there was less training samples. So 25% of all samples were used for training and 75% used for testing. So TSF better when there's more training available. And the column ensemble method outperformed the column concatenation method. Some things that would have been interesting to look at were how damping, which means that the vibrations slowly die out, and something like noise, where a noise term is added to the motion of each spring. It would have been interesting to see how the classification algorithms performed with those sort of factors that would complicate the motion more. But basically the conclusion is that they both perform pretty well, but if you have a limited training sample supply, RISE may be the better option. And the other conclusion is that column ensemble is generally better. I didn't perform any timing analysis, but just on my computer, column ensemble was significantly slower than column concatenation. Basically because twice as many estimators have to be trained in column ensemble, or as many dimensions as you have, whereas in column concatenation, only one estimator, but on a larger time series. So this concludes my project. Hopefully you all found it interesting.